Hello, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives. And we welcome back our good friend Harley Schlanger of the LaRouche organization this morning to talk economics, which I think is the real strength that I find in the LaRouche materials is how to fix the economy so that we can regain our sense of American sovereignty and a positive outlook for our future generations. So let's get started. Hello, once again, I'm John O'Loughlin, and with me this morning for our usual every other Tuesday get-together is our good friend Harley Schlanger of the LaRouche organization and the Schiller Institute over in Germany. Hello, Harley, how are you?
Hi, John. Doing pretty well.
Pretty well, I guess we'll take that. The the
Could
stock
be worse. Let's put it that way.
the stock market's doing pretty well as far as I can see, and although it's always scary, something makes me feel a little bit better about the future when I see the stock market is continuing to go well. However, there's a lot of warning flags, and the concentration, as you have pointed out, in AI may turn out to be a huge bubble that we're going to have to deal with. Well, I asked you this morning to start off, if you would, with a basic explanation of LaRouche's four economic laws, and let's just go from there.
Well, he started the development of this idea of four laws based on a study of Hamilton and how the American founding fathers got us out of debt at the end of the Revolutionary War. We had a pretty substantial debt, at least compared to the size of the economy. And there were some who said, cancel it. Hamilton said, you can't do that or you'll never be able to borrow again. Others said, pay it all off and get out of there. And Hamilton said, no, that's not the way to do it. And Hamilton came up with this conception that a national debt handled well could be a national blessing, meaning it would prepare the way for borrowing whenever that was necessary, but not to cover existing expenses, but to have cash or credit available for future expansion. And so that's the starting point of the four laws. You need to have a regulated banking system.
Can I just stop you right there? Just because that's the one that is my choke point right there. You've just spent all the last 8 years defeating the empire, right? And what do you win? You should be winning freedom from the entanglement with said empire. But what Hamilton is saying is, oh, no, well, let's go ahead and guarantee that we'll pay them back, and our farmers will pay them back. And all those loans that the rich people of Great Britain who were behind the damn war are going to get our money. That, I think, is a choke point that I still have trouble with, because where is our sovereignty if we're continuing indebtedness to the same foreign country that was trying to turn us into slaves?
Well, that's the key point of Hamilton economics, which is that by becoming creditworthy, by building your economy as a physical economy as opposed to a monetary system, you actually do have freedom. And that's what he did. He said that we need the capability to expand when necessary, that would go beyond the ability of the poor Americans at that point to fund it. And so what he said is that the United States was funded in the Revolutionary War by American citizens, and as well as by some from Europe, including bankers. So the question that was posed by this, the people who said, don't pay it back, what do you say to the poor family members of the American colonial fighters who took the few pennies they had and put it into war bonds. You're going to cut them off too? And so what Hamilton said is that in order to be fair and to establish a principle of credit, we're going to borrow against the money that we owe to use it to build an economy which will be the guarantor of our independence and sovereignty. So the point is that he wasn't just saying we're going to pay back all the speculators. He basically said we're going to get rid of this debt so that we can use whatever we generate in the future for our future production to guarantee our sovereignty. And here's the proof of the pudding, John. It worked. They paid off the Revolutionary War debt. And they did it in such a way as to build a new national economy. And so Hamilton's proposal and his system worked. Now, he was attacked because in some cases, the people who had the loans from the collection of the loans owed by the U.S. were people who were speculators who bought the debt from Americans who had to sell it to stay alive. And so he was criticized for that. But his point was that if we can do this and get out from under this debt with a sound economy and a good name, we'll be able to sustain our sovereignty long into the future. So that was what he was betting. And he was right. It worked. That he didn't sell the United States out to the usurers. He got us out from under the power of the usurers to manipulate us. What happened is that the usurers became very clever, and they figured out how to attack the idea of the national bank so that there was no way to generate credit internally. So you can't just take the debt question. He wrote one report on the public credit, where he discussed this question of the importance of solvency, of being able to pay your debts. But then he said, what's the purpose of paying your debts? It's not just to get out from under debt. It's to be creditworthy so that when you need it, you can borrow money to invest in the areas of future production. So it was totally oriented toward physical economic advance. Now, that's the first law, a banking system that's controlled by the nation, not by the speculators. And the Bank of the United States had on its board a handful of bankers, but most importantly, the policy was in the hands of the Congress, which meant in the hands of people like Hamilton and his allies. And so if they needed credit, they could generate it. They wouldn't have to go back to speculators per se. They'd proven that they were creditworthy. Now, once that was done, the question was, what do you invest the money in? Do you just take the money that you get from sales of goods and trade and pass it around so everyone feels good? Or do you invest it? And this is where the function of the national bank also worked, as a credit agency and also as an institution that dispensed credit where it was needed. And in that sense, Hamilton trusted what you might call today the local banker. He didn't trust the big guys. He trusted the people who were close to the production process, and that they would be the ones who would determine where the investments in the future would go. And so it worked out very nicely, because what Hamilton laid out as a priority was investment in infrastructure. And why infrastructure? Because with infrastructure, you decrease the cost of everything, assuming you do good infrastructure, because it makes the ability to deliver goods faster, to bring the raw materials from the market to the factory, and so on. So you have the national banking system, which is regulated, and regulated not by the bankers, but by an outside agency. And that's what Glass-Steagall was done under Franklin Roosevelt. Took it out of the hands of the Federal Reserve and put it back in the hands of the Congress. Now, that was attacked as infringing on the right of bankers to make a profit. And FDR said, screw your profits, we've got to rebuild the country. And he essentially intimidated those bankers into accepting the policy, although they did everything they could to smear him and slander him as an economic royalist, the same way they attacked Hamilton. So you have the National Bank as a credit agency, one that's regulated, one that makes credit available for the investment in future physical economy. And then the last point of LaRouche's 4 laws is where you invest it to get the maximization of profit. In those areas which increase the energy flux density of the system, that is constantly increasing the power that moves things. And secondly, along with that, you look for the areas of technological breakthroughs that are necessary to move to the next level. So science driver innovation. So those are the basic 4 laws: a regulated banking system, a credit system, infrastructure investment, and future investment in areas that will increase the productivity of labor. Hamilton's focus, if you read his writings, was on increasing the productive power of the workforce, that you put money where it will have the most impact to generate new physical wealth. And he was attacked all the time by those who thought the purpose of a banking system is monetary profit, to figure out where to invest to get the quickest rate of return, who to take advantage of, a typical imperial system. Hamilton fought that. Hamilton was opposed to the idea of the empire. He was, by the way, also, John, he was opposed to slavery. And he worked with other leading founding fathers who wanted to make sure that slavery was not accepted in the Constitution. So his idea was that you set up an economy to increase the overall power of the productive labor of your workforce. And if we stuck with that, we wouldn't have a $38 trillion debt. We wouldn't have decaying cities. We wouldn't have collapsed education. We wouldn't have decaying infrastructure. We'd be a very different country. In fact, we might look a little bit more like China.
Well, that's a provocative comment, because a lot of people do not want to look like China right now.
Well, if they actually understood the physical economic situation of the United States, they'd realize that our economy is hanging on the thinnest of threads, which is the willingness of other countries and private investors to bet that the United States will fulfill its debt obligations. Right now, we're closer to defaulting on our debt than probably at any time in previous history. The debt's larger, the plant and equipment, the innovation is lower. The area where there's innovation is area in data management, metadata collection, not physical goods. And they use the data collection to figure out how to convince you to buy things you don't need that you can't afford. With credit, you have to borrow from banks at 19%. So our economy has moved into a Ponzi scheme, which is propped up by the American people's willingness to accept the idea that, don't worry, someone will always come and pay the debt. And that someone, unfortunately, is you, because that's where the debt gets paid. And you pay for it in reduction of services. You pay for it in weakening of the value of the dollar and so on. So unless we make the steps of reform of the financial system so that we treat it as an economic system as opposed to a money-making machine, unless we do that, we're going to see a crash at some point, just as LaRouche forecast the 1987 stock crash, the dot-com bubble crash, the 2007-2008 real estate mortgage-backed securities crash, and then the 2020 repo crisis. He's been spot on every one of his forecasts, because what he looks at is not how do you make monetary profit, but how does a physical economic system generate the capability for there to be a monetary system to make sure people can feed themselves and educate themselves and provide health care and so on? So the emphasis has to be on the physical side of production, not the consumption side. And we've been turned into a consumer society where the goal is to have as much money as you can have to buy for the things you want and don't need. And that's why we're in a constant boom bust cycle. And we're heading now, without having had such a big boom period, into another potential bust with the AI economy.
What about war? What about the war economy? That's what I think we could do without. Um, and all of that is tied up with loans from international banks. This stuff is not something that Congress can really control unless Congress
Of course it
declares.
could. Of course it could.
Well,
Why do we have a war economy? Who
yeah,
are we fighting? Who are the enemies?
yeah.
We created the so-called terrorists so we could have a war on terror, so we could establish a security state. That had nothing to do with Islamic jihadists wanting to fight and overturn the United States. You look at the actual record and you see that it was all of your buddies, the Dulles family and people like that, who came up with this great idea of creating enemy operations to give us an enemy to fight. The other part of the war economy is to control raw materials. And why is that? Because we want to have the imperial power to decide which countries succeed and which countries fail. And the use of the economic hitmen, the establishment of the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, institutions like that, were designed to ensure that those countries that have economic power will be able to sustain the control over the terms of trade. This is all modeled on the British Empire. And so if you don't have an imperial succubus there, you don't have a drive for war. The purpose of, for example, why would we go to war with China? Does it hurt the United States if the Chinese people are living better lives? Does it hurt us if China is able to provide a better standard of living for their people and create a 350 million person middle class? How does that hurt us? Well, we're told that they're stealing our markets. How are they taking our markets away from us? By being more productive. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, you could argue that China took over whole sections of the world market by underselling based on cheap labor. Now, we're the country that thrives on cheap labor. And the Chinese are increasing their standard of living to lift 800 million people out of poverty in the last 20 years. So the problem is not Xi Jinping or Putin, that Putin somehow is destroying the United States. We're in a war with Russia because the United States chose to overturn the legally elected government of Yanukovych in Ukraine because they wanted the Ukrainian raw materials available to the London and Wall Street corporate cartels. That's why the Ukraine war started. And to have a marcher state well armed on the border of Russia. So again, war is the means of enacting geopolitical doctrine. And geopolitical doctrine is about how an empire can sustain itself without having to go through transformations of economic development. In other words, by being a predatory country. That's the whole point of the economic hitmen.
Everything just seems to me, in my view, to just go back to the assassination of Kennedy, because that Kennedy's policy was to let the rest of the world be the rest of the world and let them develop. And again, why would we be threatened if China develops? What we should be doing is developing at home. I hear from President Trump that he's concentrating now on our hemisphere, that basically walking away from Europe, walking away from fighting with Putin, and we're just going to increase our own security and our own economy here in our hemisphere. And in order to do that, well, we're going to have to get the Chinese out of Venezuela. We're going to have to make a deal with Russia to get their warships off of the coast. What do you think about Trump's policy in terms of sensible economics that we try to get, that obviously you and I would love to get back into?
Well, there are a couple things that Trump has done that are useful, at least in terms of what he says he's going to do. Getting industrial jobs back for the United States, getting away from the self-destructive, suicidal green policy, which is based on bad science and false remedies. So there are a couple of things like that where Trump is going in the right direction. But what is behind it is this idea, which is not so different than the neoconservatives and their idea of a sole superpower, that the United States must be the determining factor in a unipolar order. And in Trump's national security memo that was just passed or just introduced last month, it says that we have to be the sole power in the Western Hemisphere. Now, why? What's so magical about that? How about if we really want security, we befriend these other countries, we help them develop, we help them become wealthy enough that their people can stay there and not come over here unless they want to. You know, the whole argument about immigration as a threat to the United States, who created the immigrant problem? The wars and the economic policies where people can't afford to live in their home countries. So they're pulled instead to the United States or Europe. And if they can get a handout, fine for them. But they have a more secure life in some ways, at least until ICE started going crazy. But the whole point of immigration, it's another one of these self-inflicting wounds, like the war in Syria, the war in Afghanistan. We're worried now about Afghan wild potential terrorists in the United States. In Germany, the idea of Syrians as terrorists and rapists and so on. Well, why are they here? They came here because we armed the jihadists in their country. We overturned their country's efforts to have a self-sustaining sovereign nation. So we have the completely wrong assessment. And yet, instead of challenging that, we're told, well, unless we're the sole superpower, we're going to have to deal with all these gnats and worms and other problems coming our way. But we created those. Or let me say, if we didn't create them, we prevented them from resolving the paradox of living next to the richest country in the world and yet having little access to the technology, the science, and the resources that made the United States such a power. Now, ironically, the original intent of the Monroe Doctrine was to protect the South American and Central American countries from European imperial interests. Mm-hmm. That is, so they could be sovereign and develop their economies. And now we're saying if China comes in and builds a railroad that connects the Pacific coast of Chile with the Atlantic coast of Brazil, that's a threat to us. Why? How does that threaten us? Are people really afraid that China is going to take over all the raw materials and build giant battleships and come and attack the United States the way we've done to the rest of the world? Well, we do have some say over that. And that's what our doctrine should be, that we defend the right of every country to have development. If we don't like the way they're doing it, we can offer suggestions. We can help them. But we don't go in and overthrow a government because it says we're keeping our resources to serve our own people.
Should every country have its own currency?
Well, that's something that should be negotiable. In some cases, The reason the dollar became the world currency is that it was the strongest economy left after World War II. And you certainly couldn't use the Mexican peso or the Italian lira or something like that. But you could establish an exchange system that was fair and equitable. That's what the Bretton Woods system was about. And to make sure it had some kind of mooring to reality, we had it as a gold reserve system, so that at the end of any trading session or period of time, if you had debts owed to you by another country by holding their currency, if they had to, they could retire that debt by using gold. But for the most part, because the system was mutually beneficial, you didn't have to get the gold. You could use currency that would substitute for the physical gold. But you knew it was there. There was always a floor. Where's the floor today? What would happen if a significant portion of the $38 trillion US deficit comes due at a certain period of time? Could we pay it? No. What would we do? Just print money? And why should any country accept printed US dollars if there's nothing to back it up? So the Hamiltonian system, and that's why, going back to Glass-Steagall, you have a banking system which is transparent, in which the terms of trade are known before they're done. And if you need to have imbalances corrected, you can do it through treaty organization, treaty agreement, as opposed to going in and seizing gunboats or seizing physical assets. So the system actually worked okay. It wasn't great. There were problems with Bretton Woods, which were largely the problems of how do you deal with the countries that were bankrupted during World War II. And that was largely handled through investment in those countries, including in energy resources in particular. And it was moving along pretty well until we had the period of 2007, 2008 with the blowout. And that blowout was based on what? Trying to recapitalize on an existing limited value resource, namely home ownership. The creation of mortgage-backed securities depended upon the dividing of mortgages, in a sense, taking pieces of maybe 100 mortgages and putting them together and assuming that the value in the mortgage would be realized because you have 100 different people paying into the mortgage-backed security. Now, if everyone's in good financial shape, it could have worked. The problem is, in order to sell these things, they had to create a large number of them, and it meant they had to put a lot of people in the houses based on a lack of resources to cover the initial cost of the mortgage. And so when people started defaulting on mortgages, boom, the whole system blew. And what happened then? Because it wasn't a regulated system, the too big to fail bankers, the Jamie Dimons, the Moynihan from Bank of America and others, were at the head of the line with their buddies Hank Paulson, George Bush, Barack Obama, handing out bailout funds to the big banks and kicking the little guys out of their homes by foreclosing on them. And then letting their friends at BlackRock and other Vanguard, other speculative firms come in and buy up the foreclosed properties and put them on the market as rental properties high above their actual value. And that started a new bubble. So everything we've done in the period past 1971 has been a step-by-step closer to building a bubble that's ultimately one that can't be bailed out. And I think we're seeing the prospect in front of us that this is what the artificial intelligence bubble will be.
So, yes, Congress could fix it if Congress had any nerve at all. But Congress is pretty much captured, and I don't have a lot of hope in the present Congress. But suppose that the message got out to the American people that this economy is going to crash on us, and we've got to do something. And let's throw the bums out and put some new people in, some honest economists, some people that know how we got here and how to fix it. In other words, if Alexander Hamilton were here today, what would you do with $38 trillion worth of debt? Would you refinance it? Would you walk away from it? Would you set up a bankruptcy court and try to put all of the people through bankruptcy that are holding this worthless paper? Where could we go if we had the ideal Congress that wanted to help and fix this thing?
Well, a little bit of all of that. For example, let's take a hypothetical case. Suppose John O'Loughlin is elected to the Congress.
Nope, not happening.
And you go to the Congress. Well, I said hypothetical. You go to the Congress and you introduce a return to the Glass-Steagall banking regulations. And you argue for that. And the general sense, because we're in the midst of a banking crisis, is we have to do something. How do you think Franklin Roosevelt got it passed in 1933? The bankers didn't want to give up their control. They didn't want to give up their economic royalty. But the country was in dire shape. There were millions of people on the streets. Factories shut down. Homes were foreclosed. Farms were shut down. And Roosevelt appealed to the population not to act out of fear, but out of good sense, out of economic, the measures for economic sanity. And what Glass-Steagall did is it said that we're not going to allow one group of bankers to use their banks to steal from other institutions, which is what was happening. The money was going to the commercial banks because they had more money. And smaller banks that depended on monthly payments from poorer people were not getting the money they needed. And so FDR arranged that those banks would be able to survive if they were potentially fiscally sound. Now, how do you do that? Well, John, you said it, bankruptcy reorganization. If people are unable to pay for their mortgages, you sit down with them and you look at what they actually have. Do they have some way to make monthly payments? Or can we give them some leeway, some basically a vacation from making regular payments with the intent to make sure they're able to do that later on? Now, that was essentially what was done under Glass-Steagall. People were given a certain amount of debt relief in a certain amount of time. And some people who obviously had no capacity to pay off what they owed would have to lose the little they had. Now, that's also why FDR did unemployment insurance. That's why he had some of these other measures, including pension fund reform and things of that sort, so that people would have something. And there would be emergency funds available to keep people alive. But the way he could do that was by ensuring that the physical economy as a whole would function. So, it's not as though you have a bunch of royalists sitting back there saying, okay, this one lives, this one goes. You have to look at the potential actual value of businesses, of properties to sustain a debt. And in cases where you need a vacation from payments, you can work it out. Especially, this was the whole point of the local banker. They would know the people who took the loans, whether they were trustworthy or not. And that's something right now, you don't really have that. The people who are trustworthy are the ones who are the buddies who rub elbows with the major bankers at the country club. And if you're not in that country club, you know it. And you don't get the loans, you don't get the leeway. So we need a system that protects that. And it doesn't protect people who just openly cheated and committed fraud. But where was the biggest fraud in the 2007-2008 period? It came from the rating agencies who were working together with the financial institutions. It came from the financial institutions that lied about their assets. And it came from the banks that insisted that these things be paid first. And so you had the irony of Obama, who was elected supposedly as the people's president, who went to the bankers in the first month of office and said, give me what I'm asking you for in reform, because I'm the only thing standing between you and the people carrying spears in the lynch mob. And of course, the bankers gave him what he wanted. And what did he want? To save the bankers. And that's what the Dodd-Frank bill was about. That's what was the Troubled Asset Relief Plan. It was a giant bailout of swindlers and an unwillingness to face reality, that we had run into a bankruptcy because of the banks opening the doors to nothing but speculation.
You know, all of those things that are directed at saving the little person from drowning in an unpayable situation and losing everything. That's great. I mean, I'm glad that we did it. But how does something like that work when you're dealing with a $38 trillion national debt? I mean, first thing I think of is that it's not the individuals in this country that are bankrupt. It's the country itself that's bankrupt.
That's the point.
And so we need to put the country through a bankruptcy proceeding and say, hey, you Congress, President, Supreme Court, you guys have been doing a great job, but you really screwed up on the economy. So we're going to have to put you through a bankruptcy proceeding. And then we'll decide, who gets a haircut, and who has to walk away and pound sand. But that I guess is the unspoken answer, is that the United States government is bankrupt. So let's deal with it.
Well, and that's the point. What they did was they said the problem is not enough liquidity. And that's true. There wasn't enough liquidity. Why? Because many corporations weren't making any money. That the money that was being loaned out was loaned out for fly-by-night scams that didn't produce revenue, because they didn't produce anything physical that people wanted. They convinced people that if you buy this financial innovation, this derivative or this stock that's going through the roof, like NVIDIA today, if you buy this, you'll be rich forever. Buy Bitcoin today, you'll be rich forever. And so you get people to mortgage everything in their current value to get enough money to borrow to buy a speculative stock. And what happens when it goes, then there's a downturn? Where do they turn? So what should be done is you have to look at where the potential future soundness of the economy will come from. I'm missing the word there for a second. Solvency. That people confuse liquidity with solvency. They think if you have the access to the cash, you're therefore solvent and you're not bankrupt. Well, no, you're the worst kind of welfare cheat of all. You're expecting the government to bail you out based on who you are, as opposed to looking at the actual books and realizing you can't pay this. Now, unless someone's involved in actual thievery, you don't put them in jail for that, but they're going to have to go through some hard times. But you have a mechanism to help people under those circumstances and put them back to work. You can't do that when you are moving away from a physical economy into a purely speculative system. And what's the value that's produced from all the algorithms and metadata that they're buying and selling? Well, the truth of this is that the AI economy is trying to get people to buy things through advertising and control and marketing that they don't need and they can't afford, and to mess with use through surveillance technologies and so on to see what people like and what they want, and then make it available to them. Now, we have to change from that. There can't be a system where everybody's going to get everything they want when they want it. I know that's what my little girl thinks, that if she wants something, Papa's got to get it for her right away. But she's 7 years old. What do you do when it's a banker who comes to the Federal Reserve and says, look, my bank's about to go under. I need $10 billion. And I'll give you the future earnings from the bank. And a real regulator would say, well, your future earnings don't amount to a hill of beans. So you have to go through bankruptcy reorganization. That's why we have bankruptcy reorganization, to be able to determine what's actually valuable and potentially creditworthy, as opposed to what's a song and a prayer.
So, getting back to the United States is bankrupt idea. I mean, are you behind that? Do you agree with me that really the most greatest? I mean, if we were to reorganize this debt and get rid of 20% of it, or even maybe more than that, but if we could get that thing that debt off of the shoulders of the future, then that means that we don't have to pay so many taxes. And if we sold it in that way, people would say, look, we've had a lot of really disastrous economic policy for decades. Time to give ourselves a break by reorganizing our finances. Let's put the whole national debt through a bankruptcy process. What do you think?
Well, if you have a commitment from the government to do that, and a commitment from the banking system to do that,
the banking system won't agree.
Well, no, the people who are the outright swindlers are going to probably have to go to jail. What I've said is that we have to get rid of bailouts, bail-ins, and bail for corrupt bankers. So, you have to determine, though, whether someone was making loans to save their own skin as a banker, as opposed to someone who's trying to help people who are in need. And then you have some kind of federal mechanism to help those people. But the real problem, John, is how do you get the economy running again? You've got to have a credit system. And the problem is you're not going to be able to get loans from around the world if we're defaulting on loans like crazy. But you don't need loans from around the world. You can establish a principle of credit within your own country, provided there's a guarantee of sovereignty from your government, and the people are going to defend that and protect it. The problem is when people start expecting something for nothing. And who are the biggest welfare frauds? The too big to fail bankers. They basically said, well, we can go ahead and go out on a limb, and if worse comes to worse, Uncle Sam will come and bail us out. Well, Uncle Sam has to say, no way. If you can't show a way that you can, over time, and maybe you give them 10 years to work out the debt. That's not unreasonable. But you have to have some kind of horizon of when you're going to be able to approach, and you don't even have to approach break even, but at least a guarantee that you're not throwing good money after bad or bad money after worse. And that's the role of a regulated banking system. Now, we've always had people who are good bankers. We've also always had swindlers and who ran Ponzi schemes. And the whole idea of regulation is you train a section of the security of your country to be able to determine the difference between a swindler and a person who just made a bad decision.
The fourth point of the four laws, energy flux density, if I'm not mistaken, that's a big phrase to people that haven't heard it before. I've studied it. I understand what you guys mean by it. It sounds like productivity. Like let's make our country more productive again. How?
Get bigger returns for what goes in. And how do you do that? You can either do it by working people to death or by improving the productivity of labor through technological advance. And that's how we've done it historically. Technological advance, scientific research and development. What's the first thing that was cut by banks in the period since 1971 to the present? Research and development. They say that's not worth it. Job training, education. No, it doesn't help. We need something that will give us money today. And so they bring in people who will look around the world and see what's the best rate of return you can get on a bond from a poor country. And often when you do that, you end up buying bonds that are going to go under. I mean, Jamie Dimon said there's a $141 trillion bond bubble that could pop. How are you going to cover that? You think 38 trillion is a lot? What about 141 trillion? And he said, I'm not worried about it because we'll be okay. But you, the investor, should be worried about it. So that they use scare tactics to get people to stay in line.
It looks like an impossible thing to keep going in the direction that it's going, but on the other hand, it seems to me to be the most likely thing, is that we're just going to keep going in the same direction because
until it crashes.
Well, yeah.
What happens, John, if there's a crash and you have a government that says, okay, we're not going to bail out the swindlers. We're going to use whatever power we have to keep people alive and to restart physical production. Now, that's what China had to do. That's what Germany did after World War II. They didn't have accumulated capital. They had a potential workforce, but they didn't have resources. They didn't have machine tools. Their machine tools were destroyed in the war. How did we rebuild it? Credit. The Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau, the German credit institution, which took some of the cash from the Marshall Plan and used that as seed capital to extend loans to people they knew would be able to build companies that would be profitable. It worked. That's not so long ago, is it? What China did, that's in the last 20 to 30 years. That's not so long ago. And instead, we accuse China of cheating. Well, they didn't cheat. They did what the United States did in the middle of the 19th century, what Germany did at the end of the 19th century. We could do that again.
What's the problem with it? The big obvious problem to me is that our government has allowed when some business, some big like steel or nuclear or anything else gets that credit, builds up with the assistance of the government, and then it's all just privatized. And the same thing with when you talk about research and development, well, all the patents are already owned. You know, people have prepared hundreds of thousands of patents of things that may work, may not work. But if you're in your garage trying to make something new, you know, build a better mousetrap, forget it, because everything, all the avenues of individual productive growth, the ideal garage tinkering person that comes up with $1 million idea, it's all shut down now.
No, I don't think that's true at all, John. Look at where are the most patents right now in the world?
I don't know.
New patents, China.
Okay.
When you have an industrious workforce that's committed to achieving a just building up of its economy, they'll come up with new ideas. Now, I think I told you I have to leave a little bit early.
Yeah.
So what I would say is we should just pick up here next time I'm on with you, because this is what people really need to talk about. how do you restore sanity to an economic system when it looks like the lunatics are controlling the levers of power? And at some point, you have to say, look, the emperor has no clothes. Their policies aren't going to work. If you keep doing the same thing over and over again, you're not going to produce a profit. You're just going to grind this machinery into rubble. So we need some really creative, energetic young people to work with us to help push through this idea that we have a system that can function if we take the power away from those people who currently have it. And their power is based on what? Control of media and control of credit. And that's what the fight has to be in the midterm election. And it's going to be tough. The midterms elections are coming up pretty quickly. So we got to see if we can find, if you're not going to run, we got to find some people who can run, who understand this.
Well, wherever you are in the world, keep an eye on Jose Vega in the Bronx, running for Congress. He's one of those young voices that I admire so much. And Harley, I'm sure you second my endorsement of Jose's attempt to take the seat in Congress for the Bronx at the midterms. It's really interesting. It's very interesting how things that Trump's have been really causing him to lose a lot of support among young people. And I hope he turns that around, because we don't need a Democratic Congress already.
No.
Okay. Harley, thanks. I know you got to go.
Okay. We'll talk, I guess. We'll have to check the calendar. What's 2 weeks from today?
Yeah. If it's not on a holiday, I'm sure we'll go forward. And
well, 2 weeks from today is Christmas, isn't it? Christmas
I don't
Eve?
know. I haven't looked.
Yeah.
All right.
We'll figure it out.
We'll sort it out, folks. Thanks again, Harley Schlanger, and everybody have a great afternoon. Bye-bye now.